Hello viewers, this is your host Ashish Chopra welcoming you once again to your own very program, To the Point, where we have people from cross sections of society who are not only trying to make a difference in their lives but also in the lives of others. Today we have a very special guest with us, Mr. Kanak Dixit, one of the most versatile media persons in South Asia. At the moment he is the editor of the Himal South Asian magazine and also is editing a vernacular newspaper in Nepal. He has been in news recently for many things. First, he was fighting for the freedom of press and he had to see the face of jail many times now. Welcome to Guwahati, Mr. Kanak Dixit, and also welcome to Northeast Television. What brings you to Guwahati?
There's a lecture organized in the memory today, 9 August, of Kamala Saikia, who was murdered some years back for being a journalist and speaking out. So this is a lecture in his memory. That's what brings me to Guwahati.
So what was your topic of discussion and your lecture today?
Integrity in journalism, particularly the need for integrity in areas that are unstable. And integrity goes beyond the needs of objectivity, which every journalist must have. Yes. Fact-checking, rigor in writing, even ethics. Integrity is when you are challenged and when you have something to fear by printing or publishing something, and yet you go ahead and do it because you got the facts. That's the idea.
So you have been traveling, and I've been through your magazine many times, and Himal is one of the most well-documented magazines which at least I have come across on various issues, including environment and social issues and cross-cultural issues. And I think your magazine was probably the first magazine really to highlight South Asian culture. How did this idea of Himal come across when you started the magazine?
Well, I did want to go beyond the realm of nationalistic journalism. If you notice, all so-called national journalists in each capital first look at the world through the prism of the nation state, their nation state, and I felt that there must be much more to journalism and to life than that. And being from Nepal, it was slightly easier to countenance regional journalism because I do not wish ill on any nation state, but I do believe that South Asia as a cultural entity precedes the nation state, and the nation states of South Asia are created in 1947, most of them, and this so-called Westphalian definition of sharp borders goes against the nature of South Asia, of the history. So there's something unnatural in all of us, and we felt that without doing romantic journalism, without trying to have ideals that are beyond reach, why not try to reach out for journalism that is also cross-border, and that is the idea.
For the past few years, Nepal has been in news for the wrong things. Actually, let's put it that way. There's been a lot of turbulence, there has been a lot of violence, aggression, many people have died. The present situation is rather serious as of now. You have been in the forefront and spearheading a movement for freedom of press, and apparently you were sort of also put behind bars, in jail several times while you were leading this movement of freedom of press. Now tell us, what is the exact situation in Nepal now?
Well, to begin with, of course, I was part of a group of very committed journalists. I wouldn't consider myself as leading, but it was a privilege to be a Nepali citizen, a Nepali journalist in this last couple of years, because very few people in their lifetime get the privilege of speaking up for what one thinks is right, and then to be part of a movement where entire people rise up in a people's movement, the kind that hasn't been seen in South Asia in decades. The people of Nepal did that, and we had the privilege to be part of it. It was like, firstly, there was the violence of the Maoists, and there was a lot of people taking cover, not speaking out, because one is always scared about
what brought about this violence and this movement of the Maoists? in Nepal, because it was sort of unheard of for many, many years, and
Well,
suddenly
there was certainly a lot of bottled up emotions, angers, historical angers. The only question is whether it could have been or should have been tackled with a gun, and the answer for me clearly is no, because I'm not a pacifist to the extent that I don't think the gun should never be raised. There are occasions when they could be, but the conditions were not obtaining in Nepal. Nepal needed a social revolution to upturn the historical legacies of disfranchisement, etc. But the Maoists arrived, picked up the gun, romanticized a lot of young boys and some girls, and took them into the jungle. And I believe that is, during that period there was a lot of fear from the Maoists, besides a lack of professionalism in media. So media did not give adequate coverage to the rise of the Maoists after they went underground and started their so-called People's War in 1996. But then what happened was that Gyanendra became king, and he took over, and he suddenly started acting more and more the autocrat, and finally on 1 February 2005 he actually conducted a military coup, and then again people kept quiet. So this was a time when suddenly everybody was fearful of the Maoists, fearful of a king, and the pride of the moment for us as journalists, and particularly I must mention vernacular journalists who write in Nepali, because in Nepal English language journalism doesn't have that much of a, hasn't sunk its roots, which is fortunate I think, because political change comes from the strength and objectivity and professionalism of vernacular journalism, and that was what got things changing in Nepal.
Do you think the most of the Maoist activity came to the forefront because of economic reasons, and also because of lack of large-scale corruption in the government?
That is always there all over the world, but it is only when motivated individuals who are essentially political entrepreneurs decide to take that as an excuse, because the harder job is to be like a Lula of Brazil. Work for 30 years in the outside of politics. Don't try to short circuit the process and get to the front. But the good news in Nepal, however, which is what the people's movement did, is when the Maoists about 2 years ago realized that there was the Maoists realized about 2 years ago that they could bring the country to a standstill, but there was no way they could get to capture state power through the power of the gun. So they decided to make a switch in strategy, which is a very welcome switch in strategy. They decided we must come into above ground politics, competitive above ground politics, as they said it. And that was what the political parties were waiting for, because you see, on the one hand, what had happened up to 2 years ago was you had the Maoist gun, you had the army gun, and the Nepali army at that time, now it's called the Nepal Army, then it was called the Royal Nepal Army, was extremely brutal in its own. Its brutality matched the brutality of the Maoists. The Maoists would put landmines in public roads, and the army would drop mortars from helicopters. So brutality, disappearances,
so it was a common man which got into a cross section.
Very violent. I don't think even the Northeast has seen that shortened version of extreme violence.
So this is more like a civil war than anything else.
In a civil war, and there were days when there was a whole period last year when on average 7 to 8 Nepali citizens were dying every day. People would die, 60 people would die overnight, and by the third day it would fail to make news. So we had become a country that we did not recognize. But what changed was that the king had his gun through the army, the Maoists had the gun. The political parties in the middle, the so-called middle ground, and civil society had no role, and the politics had evaporated from the country. But then what happened was the Maoists realized, firstly, they could not take over the state, not only the capital, none of the 75 district headquarters. They had the run of the villages, but they couldn't take over district headquarters and keep them even for one night, much less for a longer period. So they realized that that was the reality. So how much longer will you keep fighting in the bush? Secondly, the international pressure. It was clear that the international community, and especially most importantly India as a very powerful neighbor of Nepal, would never allow Maoists with the gun in government. So these two realizations made the Maoists say, okay, then we are willing to put down the gun. They didn't say that in so many words, but when they said we are willing to enter peaceful multi-party politics, that is when the political parties who had been rejected by the king continuously agreed with the Maoists in negotiations held semi-underground in New Delhi through the autumn of 2005.
So you think the government of India played a very important role in bringing,
I think
trying to bring a
not
build
bring
a
them
bridge?
together. The government of India played a very important role by looking the other way, which is a very wise thing to do, because the political parties and the Maoists could not have talked inside Nepal, where the king was ruling an autocratic state, a militarized state. And this is the one thing I must mention also. King Gyanendra tried to militarize Nepal. The only saving grace was that he didn't have the mental or organizational capacity to see through. That was our saving grace for the people of Nepal. We'd have been a Burma or a Pakistan, but we didn't, because we could push back the king. What happened with those talks in Delhi was the Maoists and the political parties therefore decided to work in concert to overthrow the king's regime. Till that time, the political parties had not been able to bring masses to the streets of Kathmandu or in the Mofassal, because they could only promise democracy if they fought. They couldn't promise peace. Once they had this collaboration with the Maoists going, which was going to be an insurgence and a political opposition, then the political people realized that, okay, if the political parties are able to bring the Maoists in, that means peace will also come through this route. So then the people abandoned the king totally.
Okay, now the institution of the king, I'll come to the institution of the king. It has been a very respected institution for 200 years. And now, do you think the institution of the king is finished for good and it will just go down the annals of history, or?
There is a good likelihood of that. What has happened was Gyanendra the king, it's very hard these days to say King Gyanendra, by the way. Gyanendra the king step by step deconstructed the monarchy that he inherited. He came to believe, rather idiotically, that kingship of Nepal is owned by the king, rather than being a legacy of his ancestors, and is owned by the people of Nepal. This is something that in our writings we kept trying to remind him. Why are you destroying an institution that you have inherited and you have to pass on? Instead, he proceeded to destroy it. Essentially, he did it by the coup of 1 February 2005 and running a state that was completely that showed complete contempt for the people. And so what he did, therefore,
is he also going to see the same fate as most of our erstwhile royal families in India have seen, or will he continue to be a constitutional sort of a symbolic head?
I would say that if he plays his cards right, and playing the cards right means now doing nothing. I mean, just tying your hands, taping your mouth, and keeping a low profile, which I think by personality he cannot do. So as he starts seeing the political parties mess up, as they are bound to, all political parties mess up, he might again start having a grand notions of, I will come and rescue, and then it will be over for him, no question about it. He'll be sent to exile, or kingship will be abolished. But right now there is a saving grace for him. I personally do not see how a king like Gyanendra can be king. After all that he has done, basically he tried to militarize us. That can never be okay. But as far as, if you look at it objectively, there is supposed to be a constituent assembly. A constituent assembly will define our new constitution, define our new state structure, and the negotiations are on. First we have to bring the Maoists actually to lay down the gun. At this point we only have a ceasefire.
I was coming to that point.
Okay, then let's go back to the kingship just to finish his subject off. Yes. The kingship will therefore be decided upon, as things stand, by the Constituent Assembly. When the Constituent Assembly happens, it might be a year from now, maybe a little earlier. If the king has played his card right and kept a complete low profile, there is just the possibility that the Constituent Assembly members will decide to keep a ceremonial / constitutional / symbolic monarchy. If not, if he even shows an iota of activism, I believe that the people of Nepal will just say the question does not even arise of having
because they could easily follow the Thailand example, where the monarch is respected, or the Japanese model.
Not the king would have had to, but he's already shown his cards and they have turned out to be such black cards.
You mean there is so much of vendetta against him amongst the masses now?
What he did
against the royal family?
You see, when you have, there's very little of the royal family.
Or what would you like to say, that there was total gross violation of human rights on part of the king?
Absolutely. I mean, not only that, there was gross violation of human rights, a military coup. You should remember, keep in mind that Nepal is not an atavistic, primitive country. We have seen democracy. 12 years of vibrant democracy between 1990 and 2002. People have understood what it means. They might not have got the fruits of democracy, but they certainly knew what democracy meant. And the king goes around as if he feels that he runs a, an autocratic
like
17th century state.
Own feudal domain.
Yeah, and so he tried it. It turned out that the people decided to return his contempt tenfold. But still, I think that if he plays it right, people might just allow him. But you see, when you have a king, especially a king of this kind, around, there is forever the danger of him meddling around with democracy and pluralism, and this we can't have, because in India it is, in large parts of India it's simplistic to say, oh, but we have democracy, and somebody says we have democracy, we must protect democracy. You might think that that's a truism, but in Nepal it's very real. We lost it, we've got it back, and we must nurture it and protect it, especially from the people of the extreme right represented by the king and people from the extreme left represented by the Maoists, until they put down the gun. When they put down the gun, they become a political party. For now they are insurgents still, although there is a ceasefire.
Now the Nepalese economy is also in shambles because most of it was dependent on tourism, and obviously in whichever state there is tourism, tourists will not visit, and most Western countries had declared it as a dangerous country to visit, and now that things are getting back to slight normalcy, how do you foresee the future of Nepal?
Well, tourism is already on the rebound. The monsoon is a low period, but Indian tourists come, and Nepal has a particular kind of sophistication that would attract the sophisticated Indian tourists, because we need more than the casino trippers,
yes,
which come to Nepal from Delhi and Punjab and Haryana.
The Novo-Rish.
Yes, and Nepal has the kind of experience to provide such tourists. Besides the monsoon season, when the Indian tourists come, the autumn season is looking good. Essentially, we need to sort out our political mess, which also includes what we in Nepal call management of arms, which means Hatiyar Vyavasthapan, which is a euphemism for bringing the Maoists in from the cold and creating a space for them enough that they will put down the guns. At the same time, watching that the Royal Nepal Army, now called the Nepal Army, does not become a reactionary force. So it's a delicate position, and for your viewers in the northeast, I think what Nepal, why Nepal is interesting at this point is there is a very real possibility of a violent insurgency of 11 years standing will actually be a thing of the past, and insurgents will enter the mainstream with some space made for them, not made for them in a way that pluralism is devastated. Democracy and pluralism has to be intact. So right now in Kathmandu, as we speak, there is a negotiated process underway in which what are the conditions under which the Maoists will put down the gun. Now in that, we don't call it putting down the gun, we don't call it demobilization, we call it management of arms. The one saving grace for Nepal has been India's willingness, because it is the regional power, to accede to UN involvement in the disarmament process. You see, the Maoists and the parties decided that UN involvement was required, and of course Nepal is a sovereign country, so Nepal should be allowed to make its own decision. But India is a powerful neighbor, and if India says I do not want UN moving around in my backyard, then it will be difficult even for the UN to come.
But you have an equally powerful neighbor in China, and what sort of a role will they play?
China is a distance away. Nepal borders Tibet.
Yes.
Tibet is a autonomous region of China, but the mainland is pretty far away.
On paper, yes, it is an autonomous.
So no, that's what is known as officially, yes. TAR. China's role in Nepal is much slimmer than the India. India is such a regional giant that even if it doesn't move, even if it doesn't do anything,
culturally also there is much more affinity to India than.
So what India did that was significant is, firstly, the Indian foreign policy, even though there were pushes and pulls within the Indian establishment, some members of the Indian establishment wanted to support the king, wanted to support the army during the time of the democracy deficit, but overall Indian foreign policy was to stand on the side of the Nepali people and democracy, and pointing a finger at the king. After this, after the king was brought down by this grand people's movement, which by the way was a real upsurge, where the people of Nepal proved that they really understood the meaning of peace and democracy, because we did not need a Nelson Mandela, we did not need a Mahatma Gandhi or a BP Koirala. People of their own understanding, without the need for an iconic leader, decided to go ahead. So all that led to the success of the people's movement. The king was brought down. Now India had to make a decision to allow, after having played such a facilitatory role when the parties and the Maoists were talking in Delhi by themselves, now India was asked to allow Nepal, under its sovereign right, to have UN involvement in the arms management process, which would mean a process in which the government of Nepal and the 7-party alliance and the Maoists agree to allow the UN to monitor the process, which would ultimately lead to safety and security for Maoist fighters, some level of political involvement of the Maoists in an interim government and in the process towards the Constituent Assembly. All of this requires a lot of very delicate negotiation. It is happening in Kathmandu right now.
Okay, now there's a very tricky question vis-a-vis India's security as far as the Maoist movement is concerned. If you see right from Andhra Pradesh, Andhra, Jharkhand, Bihar, even eastern UP to a large extent, the Naxalite movement has picked up Chhattisgarh substantially, and there's a serious problem that India is now facing, at least these states are facing, from the Maoist insurgents. Now it is said that there are a lot of training camps of these insurgents actually in Nepal. Now with democracy being restored, with support from India, will the present government in Nepal play an important role in curbing these insurgent camps that are probably at this point of time active in Nepal?
Well, what we know is that the insurgent camps of the kind that you mentioned are not active in Nepal, because Nepal is a relatively small country and it's got so many districts, it's possible really to monitor anything and everything that goes on. There is a meeting of minds between Indian and Nepali Maoists, and in the past there have been some training conducted by Indian Naxalites of Nepali Maoists, and there might have been also some low level training, but to think that there are training camps, I think most likely not. But India is definitely worried about copycat insurgencies in India, because the Nepali Maoists, because they come from a small and independent
So you mean they might get inspiration from the...
Yes, that has been the worry in the past, but I think that time is past, because why has Sitaram Yechuri and the CPIM been so active in trying to bring the Maoists and the political parties together so that the Maoists in Nepal would try to go for peaceful politics? It is said in so many words by the Maoist chief Prachanda. In his interview in the Hindu with Siddhartha Varadarajan, he says the way to go in the 21st century towards socialism and communism is through the parliament. And he said, I also wish that the Indian Maoists would emulate us in this way. Now I don't think this makes the Indian Naxalites very happy. Nevertheless, I think that the Indian worry about the Nepali Maoists is not so much about training camps in Nepal, but copycat insurgencies in the rest of India. And as far as that matter is concerned, the Nepali Maoists are already above ground. They are walking and they are in seminar halls and workshops in Kathmandu, and they still have the gun in hand, and that's a delicate problem for now. But in the next few weeks, I would be optimistic that a solution will be found, which would be a discussion between the political parties and the government and the Maoists, essentially, as I said, on the definition of disarmament, the definition of the term arms management, Hathiyar Vyavasthapan. Once they find the definition, which will essentially be what is the formula used, in which the state army will be kept in the barracks, the Maoist army will probably be contained in some places, and slowly a process will begin of integrating Maoist fighters into the society as a whole. This is our hope, and let us hope it works, because if that happens, Nepal's very, very violent interlude in which the Nepali people have suffered will be a thing of the past, and more importantly, Nepal would have provided South Asia with an example of an insurgency coming into peaceful politics.
Well, Kanak, thank you so much. In fact, I would have loved to speak to you, but there are constraints of time. Thank you for coming to NE TV.
Real pleasure.
Thank you.